Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this pre-concert exploration of Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time. One of the seminal works of the 20th century, and indeed one of the works in musical history with the most extraordinary, harrowing and incredible backstory as well. I'm very much looking forward to the performance by these four incredible musicians. I'm sure you are too. Which I'll be following avidly from home, unable to be at the concert myself, but it's certainly enjoyable nonetheless to be able to get into the piece this way and rediscover a masterpiece that I haven't actually played myself for several years. Here's a little taste of what's to come. Music there of great transcendence and great spirituality. So let's just talk briefly about the young Messiaen. Born into an artistic family and something of a child prodigy. So music was in his blood, and he entered the Paris Conservatoire indeed at the age of 11. Quite amazing. Began composing and playing keyboard instruments, piano and organ, winning prizes, and soon after graduation, when he'd already started composing, got himself a job as organist at one of the most important churches in Paris. So a very bright early career. When he was in his early 20s, he formed a group called La Jeune France, and that's what you can see on the slide in front of you, with three other composers. So the four of them were Messiaen and Jean-Yves Daniel Lezier, you can see him there, peering over his piano, and Yves Baudrier, sitting artistically at his piano. Lots of shadows in these photos of the time. Let's hope that style comes back soon. And André Jolivet. Now, Jolivet is a name known to me and some of his music. I've even played some of his music, but the other two have become rather obscure figures. But the four of them got together and made a sort of manifesto, made an aim to produce living music, having the impetus of sincerity, generosity, and artistic conscientiousness. Now, you might think that those were quite natural attributes that a composer would look for in his music, but I think this was a reaction against the music of the age in France. Les Six, the likes of Poulenc, Milhaud, music very much influenced by Jean Cocteau, and a feeling that there was a sort of urbanity, a certain remove from the raw emotion, you might say, of music and of art itself, which these composers wanted to restore. And this sincerity sat very well with Messiaen and his devout Catholicism, which was very much part of his makeup. The final thing to say about Messiaen maybe at this point is that his music throughout his life was described not only by others but also by himself in terms of colour, and that Messiaen had a form of synesthesia where he heard sounds but also associated them with colours simultaneously, and we'll have more of that later. Here's a quotation from Messiaen. "The human being is flesh and consciousness, body and soul. His heart is an abyss which can only be filled by that which is godly." So wonderful words there, and wonderful religious sentiment from Messiaen. Unfortunately, the war came, and in 1940, when France joined the war, many young men were enlisted, including Messiaen, and his eyesight actually was not particularly good, which meant that he was assigned as a medical orderly rather than one of the frontline soldiers. A blessing perhaps, but nonetheless his war was short-lived, and he was captured only a month or two after joining the army by the Germans and transported to a prisoner of war camp. Now the journey there would have been tough. They had to make their way to an area of then in Germany, but now in Poland. And during this journey, when one can only imagine how all of the soldiers were feeling, being transported away to God knows where and to God knows what conditions, Messiaen met a clarinetist, and they got to know one another, and quite extraordinarily, by the time they arrived at Stalag 8A, which just means, prison camp 8A, the two had made friends, and Messiaen had actually begun a solo clarinet piece for the clarinetist, who was called Henri Acoca. So even in such times as this, Messiaen's creative spirit could not be quelled, and he'd already begun to write music on the way to the camp. Here's a picture of a band made up of prisoners at that very same camp. That's not Messiaen, by the way, just to avoid confusion, but another group of musicians at a different time. It's just incredible, isn't it, just to connect with that kind of image, to imagine these people there. All manner of people, of course, called up to war. But somehow, cellos, trumpets, music stands. All this was quite extraordinary, wasn't it, really, thinking that there could even be a concert or even be music in conditions like this. It says something for the creative spirit and the fact that people need this artistic outlet somehow. They need to do these things, but also, I suppose, whatever we judge it to be, something about the German regime too that allowed these kinds of things to take place. So on arrival, you can see them at the bottom there, Acoca and Messiaen. They met two more musicians, Jean Le Boulaire, a violinist, and Etienne Pasquier, a cellist. And at this point there was no particular thought, I don't think, that Messiaen would write a quartet, but the four quickly became acquainted, and Messiaen did start quite soon to write a trio for the other three, so for violin, cello and clarinet. And indeed that was to become part of the final quartet, as was the solo clarinet piece that I've already mentioned. And little by little the idea crystallized in Messiaen's mind that he could write a work for all four of them. They were friends, clearly, and they clearly shared something, and they clearly had a passion to share their music and to create. But I suppose above all they were just thrown together in extraordinary circumstances, and one can only imagine what it must have been to them in tough conditions like this to be able to make music and to be able to discuss it and to be able to just have kindred spirits alongside. In case we should accidentally think that this was a sort of easygoing camp, pictures there of people making music, and just the idea that Messiaen would even consider composing during incarceration. Here's a quote from Le Boulaire. So many men died in captivity, and temperatures of -13 Fahrenheit were common. -13 in Poland in the winter. No central heating, it goes without saying. These were tough times. But the quartet was written. Somehow it was managed. Messiaen made friends with one of the prison guards, enough in any case to get given paper and pencils and the necessary things to put on the first performance and write the piece. Here's the poster, another extraordinary document just to look at there. Here's the poster from the première audition, the first performance, the first hearing of the quartet for the end of time. Now, there are several accounts of the first performance, and they don't all say exactly the same thing. It's interesting to compare these two from two of the players, Messiaen himself and Pasquier. And you might even chuckle at some of the differences between them, but I think at the end what we'll realise is that actually it's where they match each other which is most telling. So years later, looking back, Messiaen said, "An upright piano was brought into the camp, very out of tune, the keys of which seemed to stick at random. On this piano I played my quartet for the end of time, in front of an audience of 5,000. The most diverse mixture of all classes in society, farm workers, labourers, intellectuals, career soldiers, doctors and priests. Never have I been listened to with such attention and such understanding." Pasquier, on the other hand, says this: "The first performance of the quartet took place in the hut that we used as the theatre. All the seats were taken, about 400 in all." 400 compared to 5,000. Well, still 400 is a lot of people. About 400 in all, and people listened raptly, their thoughts turning inward, even those who may have been listening to chamber music for the first time. The concert took place on Wednesday, January the 15th, 1941, at 6 in the evening. It was bitterly cold outside the hut, and there was snow on the ground and on the rooftops. Messiaen repeatedly claimed that there were only 3 strings on my cello, but in fact I played on 4 strings. The normal 4 strings. Cellos normally have 4 strings, of course. Messiaen, you feel there, as maybe in the first account of 5,000, somehow kind of augmenting the story, but nevertheless things in both accounts are clearly in tune with one another. The harshness of the conditions, the mixture of people in the audience, but most tellingly, for me at least, the way in which the music was listened to, even by people who weren't experienced in listening to chamber music. I mean, it's a lengthy work, as you'll find out, but that they all sensed something special was there. As his inspiration for the piece, Messiaen took 2 short passages from the Book of Revelation. Illustration there on the left by William Blake, of the angel of the Revelation, who appears in the lines that Messiaen sets at the beginning of his score. "And I saw another mighty angel come down from heaven, clothed with a cloud, and a rainbow was upon his head, and his face was as if it were the sun, and his feet as pillars of fire. And he set his right foot upon the sea, and his left foot on the earth. And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven, and swore by him that liveth for ever and ever, that there should be time no longer. But in the days of the voice of the 7th angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God should be finished." And you can see there Blake's picture almost exactly matching the text from the Book of Revelation. Here's a charming little poster explaining the movements. So the piece is in 8 movements, and there's pictures there of the players. You'll see themes running through the titles of the music, which have been translated there into English. So the religious imagery, of course, the liturgy, the angel, the eternity of Jesus, or the 7 trumpets that we've heard about. But also lots of the natural world there. So we have an abyss, we have the birds, we have rainbows. And then also just some simple musical terms. So we have a vocalise or an interlude, intermezzo. So 8 movements. And you'll see also, and we'll see this as we go through, that they have a variety of instrumentation. So the whole quartet plays once, twice, 3, 4 times out of 8 only. Then there's a movement for cello and piano and violin and piano. As that movement that Messiaen had started writing for the other 3, violin, cello and piano, and then there's that solo clarinet movement that he began to write for Henri Akoka. So I always find it wonderfully kind of uplifting and exciting the way in which music is created from technical means to produce something which touches you, which touches your soul. I think of Bach's Art of Fugue, for instance, where he writes, well, a fugue itself is hard enough to master, but he expands the themes to slower note values, he speeds them up to quicker note values, he flips them round upside down. He has double fugues where he introduces 2 themes on top of each other. It's a tour de force of compositional writing, and then when you listen to it, it just goes directly to your heart. You know, you feel wonderful connection to the music in a way that gives the lie to this idea that, you know, we kind of separate, don't we, if we're not careful, the feeling bit and the technical bit. But no, somehow the technical produces the feeling. And although this is by no means an exhaustive list of Messiaen's techniques, here are 6 interesting and useful things that he does throughout his writing, but also specifically in the quartet. So he makes great use of repeating patterns. All these will be illustrated in a minute, but that doesn't really need explanation. Then there is music that recurs even in different movements. So he uses the same music again in different places in the 8 movements to kind of tie things together and to evoke similar things in different places. Then he uses what he calls modes of limited transposition, which I will explain when we get there. That's slightly more technical. Then he uses a great range of timbres, a range of different sounds, achieved through varying instrumentation and extremes of dynamic and register. So basically he wants to get the maximum that he can from his ensemble of 4 instruments. An unusual ensemble. Yeah, I think there are a few pieces before this for the same combination, but pretty rare. I mean, for instance, the most famous one I can think of is by a composer called Walter Rabel, who I can't say I know any of his other pieces. So there certainly isn't a piece for this combination of instruments by you know, one of the great canon of famous composers that we know. So it feels a little as if Messiaen had this kind of thrust upon him, and through that came a masterpiece. I mean, clearly there are many piano trios for piano, violin and cello, but when you add the clarinet, you have so many more possibilities of sound, and Messiaen uses those to the full. Then additive rhythms and palindromic rhythms, which Messiaen calls non-retrogradable rhythms. But palindromic rhythms, we'll talk about these in a minute, but you can probably guess what those are. And then extremes of tempo. This ties in with the range of timbres, really. Extremes of everything. Messiaen wants again to have the maximum possible expression. Let's look here, first of all, at repeating patterns. This is the very opening of the whole piece. And we'll hear a chunk of it to get in the mood of the quartet. Look, here we have repeated pitch patterns. So we begin here with the first go, A, and along it goes, and along it goes, and along it goes, and then here it starts again. And you can see, even if you don't read music particularly well, of the top notes there. So E down to D, that's tied over, another D down to C, another C, and the same, E down to D, another D down to C. So he's repeating the note pattern, and that carries on for the whole time. Likewise, underneath there's a rhythmic pattern. So crotchet, 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 quaver, quaver, and on it goes. Down here we go, and it starts again. Crotchet, 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 quaver, quaver, and it starts again here. So we have two simultaneous repetitive patterns going on, but not synchronized with one another, and it gives a quite extraordinary effect. Listen out also for the bird song. Clarinet first and then the violin, both imitating different birds, the blackbird and the nightingale, whilst so that's the beginning of the entire work. Incredibly atmospheric and an unusual music. Then we have music that recurs even in different movements. This doesn't really need much explanation, but you'll see that the pattern of piano chords here and here from the middle of the second movement, triple piano, is the same pattern, the same music as here in the seventh movement in forte. So very different uses of the same material. Let's just briefly. And the seventh movement. So you'll hear their music of sort of almost dreamlike. Well, you can see here the pianist is meant to play like a rainbow. And in the next movement you have these kind of granite chords of the angel. Now we come to the fearsome modes of limited transposition, but actually it's not as complicated as it sounds. In diatonic music, in tonal music, we have a major scale, we have a minor scale, and all of those can go into 12 different keys. All the semitones, 12 different possible keys. And all of those 12 keys, and this is the important bit, are slightly different. None of them are the same as one another because of the combination of tones and semitones. Semitones very close together, and a whole tone. Now, in a mode of limited transposition, you can only play it in 2 or 3 or 4 or whatever different keys, as it were, before you just end up back where you started and you're using the same notes again. That's why they have limited transposition. You can't change them into 12 different keys. The simplest, the first mode, is what we call the whole tone scale. And that one you can only transpose once. It only has two possible uses. Once I get back to here, I'm using the same notes again. And the same thing happens in these. I won't demonstrate it all to you, but if I just play you the first version of mode 2 there, you might hear a sort of sound that you'll get used to in this piece of Messiaen. You'll hear that kind of scale, those kinds of pitches throughout the quartet. As an aside, these modes resist diatonic, tonal cadences. So if I pick several notes from mode 2, you can see there, I'll take the C, E, G, B flat. I have a dominant 7th. Even if you don't know what that means, you can feel the pull of that chord to resolve. The only problem is in that mode 2 there, we don't have that note, so you can't resolve that chord to an F. Likewise, if I start on the E flat, those notes are all in the mode, but unfortunately this one isn't A flat, so I can't have a nice perfect cadence in my modes of limited transposition. A range of timbres. Here we have, again, something which doesn't need much explanation, but look, pianissimo, but triple piano in the clarinet, forte in the violin. So very different dynamics. And then the same melody here with trills on it, triple forte, fortissimo. Both of these examples from the 7th movement. You hear the clarinet just barely whispering away there, and here's the climax of the same movement. And notice how Messiaen is always keen to link these extremes of, quite basic use of texture and dynamic, quiet and loud, or high and low, to an emotional response. So here, rêveur, we're dreaming, and here we are ecstatic. And this music certainly evokes those two things like no other. Here are our non-retrogradable rhythms, but it's quite a simple concept. Palindromes are the same forward as they are backwards. So if I take the first blue example here, it goes quaver, 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 semi-quaver, quaver, quaver, quaver. So it's the same backwards as it is forwards, and it sounds like this. And you'll hear that rhythm a lot. There are more examples in blue. In red, on the second stave that you can see there, we have what we call additive rhythms. This is where here, if you can see underneath, we're going along, and then suddenly there's this quaver here with a dot, a dotted quaver. And then another longer note. So the music is just getting slower by just adding length to the notes, and it gets this sort of halting built-in effect without actually slowing down, without doing what we call a ritardando. If I play you that little bit without the additive rhythm, I'll play that again. But what Messiaen wrote, just that slight hesitation at the end, and that's another trademark of his style. Well, so much so that he gave it a name. Extremes of tempo doesn't mean need an awful lot of explanation again, but again, just to underline the fact that always with Messiaen to great emotional effect, so ecstatic to infinitely slow, ecstatic. So a semiquaver is 44. I mean, normally if a crotchet, if a note 4 times that proportion was 44, the music would be very slow, but semiquaver, it's just a message that time stands still. And we're talking throughout this piece, of course, and in the title, about the manipulation of time. This from the 5th movement, a wonderful cello and piano movement, and then fast music from the 6th movement. Such stirring music always. And maybe a good point now to acknowledge the recording I'm using after those wonderful sounds. This is a pianist called Matthew Shellhorn with members of the Philharmonia Orchestra. So let's take a little look now at the piece itself and just an overview of the 8 movements. We start with this crystal liturgy, and Messiaen was kind enough to leave us a few lines about each movement. So all these words that I'm reading you are the composer's own. Between 3 and 4 in the morning, the awakening of birds. A solo blackbird or nightingale improvises, surrounded by a shimmer of sound, by a halo of trills, lost very high in the trees. Transpose this onto a religious plane, and you have the harmonious silence of heaven. Now, we heard quite a chunk of this movement when we were looking at those repeating patterns a few minutes ago, so I won't play you an excerpt from the piece really, but just a tiny snippet from the clarinet impersonating a bird. We can hear that once more. And now to hear what was being imitated. Clearly it's not open to Messiaen to ask the clarinet to play quite that high, but otherwise I think he does get quite a lot of the spirit of the bird. And any of you who know Messiaen's music will know that later in life he became increasingly obsessed by birdsong and wrote a cycle of piano pieces, or more than one, about well, transcribing really as closely as he could the songs of different birds. The angel is back. You can see him there. Well, of course, this is his first appearance in the piece at the beginning of the 2nd movement. Again, for full ensemble. The 1st and 3rd parts, very short, evoke the power of this mighty angel, a rainbow upon his head and clothed with a cloud, who sets one foot on the sea and one foot on the earth. In the middle section are the impalpable harmonies of heaven. In the piano, sweet cascades of blue-orange chords, enclosing in their distant chimes the almost plain chant song of the violin and cello. So we'll hear a little snippet of each section. First of all, the arrival of the angel, and then described as ever in colour by Messiaen, as I mentioned, these sweet cascades. On to the third movement. And here, the very first music that Messiaen conceived then, the clarinet solo that had its first notes written on the way to Camp 8A, the Abyss of the Birds. The abyss is time, with its sadness, its weariness. The birds are the opposite to time. They are our desire for light, for stars, for rainbows, and for jubilant songs. We can hear in the excerpt I'm about to play from the first section that the sadness and the weariness. Later, when you hear the performance in the middle of this movement, we have a brighter episode where the birds appear. The words there, though, are extraordinary, aren't they? And also so evocative and important in considering this piece. The end of time, the biblical connotations, but then just time itself. The slowing of time with those incredibly slow movements where almost your heartbeat begins to slow. The sense of time when you're incarcerated, of course. The birds are the opposite of time. What a line. Now, if you're going to write a piece in 8 movements and it's going to last 3/4 of an hour or more, you probably need just a moment where you let the intensity go. And this is it, the intermezzo for violin, clarinet and cello, so the second movement that Messiaen composed. Well, he calls it a scherzo, of a more individual character than the other movements, but linked to them nevertheless by certain melodic recollections. So he's continuing to recycle the music, but this time in a much more folk-like style, much clearer rhythmic step, and a little bit of respite. The fifth movement is the one which we heard the beginning of a little while ago when we were comparing the slow and the fast music, the one marked infinitely slow. Very beautiful, and we'll leave this one, or the rest of this one, for the concert. But let's just see what Messiaen wrote. Jesus is considered here as the Word. A broad phrase, infinitely slow, on the cello, magnifies with love and reverence the eternity of the Word, powerful and gentle, whose time never runs out. The melody stretches majestically into a kind of gentle, regal distance. In the beginning was the Word, and Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now, suddenly, when you're performing this piece, it's quite a challenge. After sitting out for a couple of movements, it's the solo clarinet and the trio, and then playing some incredibly slow chords with the cellist, as pianist, you're called upon to play with plenty of virtuosity in this sixth movement, where the real kind of terror and the real magnitude of the theme of the piece comes into force. The dance, the furious dance for 7 trumpets. This is a movement where complex rhythms abound and all the instruments have to play together, exactly the same rhythm, almost from beginning to end. In the outer sections, the first 6 trumpets, and then possibly in the middle section, although everybody's still playing, the sound changes completely, and maybe this is the 7th trumpet. Rhythmically, the most characteristic piece of the series. The 4 instruments in unison imitate gongs and trumpets, the first 6 trumpets of the apocalypse followed by various disasters, the trumpet of the 7th angel announcing consummation of the mystery of God. Use of added values, of augmented or diminished rhythms, of non-retrogradable rhythms. Music of stone, formidable granite sound, irresistible movement of steel, huge blocks of purple rage, icy drunkenness. Listen especially to all the terrible fortissimo of the augmentation of the theme and changes of register of its different notes towards the end of the piece. The augmentation of the theme is where the main theme comes back slower, but fortissimo, incredibly loudly, towards the end of the movement. So we'll have a The 7th movement is somehow where the rest of the piece is summed up, musically, but also just in spirit. It's extended, it has different sections, it recalls music from all kinds of other parts of the piece. Fuis d'arc en ciel, a tangle of rainbows for the angel who's announcing the end of time. Recurring here are certain passages from the 2nd movement. The angel appears in full force, especially the rainbow that covers him. The rainbow, symbol of peace, wisdom, and all luminescent and sonorous vibration. In my dreams, I hear and see ordered chords and melodies, known colours and shapes. Then, after this transitional stage, I pass through the unreal and suffer with ecstasy, a tournament, a roundabout co-penetration of superhuman sounds and colours. These swords of fire, this blue-orange lava, these sudden stars, there is the tangle, there are the rainbows. And in case we'd forgotten, this piece written in a prisoner of war camp, extraordinary sentiment and faith. So we'll hear a little bit of this movement where the initial opening section gives way to the reappearance of the angel. And so we arrive at the final movement, which shares some of the spirit of the slow movement for cello and clearly references to Jesus in the title. But this is for violin and piano. Apologies for my mistake at the top there. This is for violin and piano. A large violin solo, counterpart to the cello solo of the fifth movement. Why this second eulogy? It's especially aimed at the second aspect of Jesus, Jesus the man, the Word made flesh, immortally risen for our communication of his life. It is all love. Its slow ascent to the acutely extreme is the ascent of man to his God, the child of God to his Father, the being made divine towards paradise. And before we hear the end of the work, let's just have one more account of the first performance from Etienne Pasquier, the cellist. Everyone listened reverently, with an almost religious respect, including those who perhaps were hearing chamber music for the first time. It was miraculous. These people who had never before heard such music remained silent. These people who were completely musically ignorant sensed that this was something exceptional. They sat perfectly still, in awe. Not one person stirred. No doubt these people resumed their original personalities afterwards, but there they were subject to a miracle, the miracle of the performance of this music.